Welcome everyone to this webinar. Today we're going to discuss wine packaging and can the wine trade both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and close the packaging loop. Before I get stuck into the main topic of the evening, I'd like to introduce each of our panelists. Thank you all of you for joining us. I'm going to introduce you in the order in which you're going to be speaking. So Richard Lloyd, who is the managing director and runs the park for Accolade, and has huge amount of experience in actually packing lots of wines into various different wine formats. Fiacre, I knew I'd get his name wrong. O'Donnell, who is from Enval Glass, who are doing lots of very interesting things, looking at renewable energy sources. He's going to talk to us a little bit about collection schemes and recycling glass. And then we have Dr. Carlos Ludlow Palafox, who is from Enval and who has developed a process for recycling flexible and composite plastic packaging. So we look forward to learning more about that. And Ollie Lee from the BiB Wine Company, a company which, as the name suggests, specializes in selling wines in bag-in-box format. So welcome to all of you guys. Before we move forward, just a little bit, I guess, of a sort of, reminder about why we have to have what wine packaging actually does. So wine packaging obviously makes sure that we get wines from wineries into consumers' glasses and that it's in tip-top condition for them to drink it. It has a functional role in terms of actually looking after that wine quality and making sure that it is right when it gets to the consumer. It also provides mandatory information to consumers on the packaging itself. But packaging also has an aesthetic role, a role in terms of engaging with consumers and through design and marketing messages, actually engaging and developing branding messages, and can be used to differentiate between different wines. And I would say that actually there's never been such a wide variety of wine packaging formats as there are around today. I mean, if you just think about glass bottles, they come in all sorts of different shapes and colors, some of them very specific to specific wineries or specific regions. But you've also got PET bottles, flat PET bottles, round PET bottles. We've got paper bottles, aluminium cans, bag-in-boxes, pouches. We've got lots and lots of different formats to work with. And whatever your packaging format, though, we need to think about the wine that's going into the packaging and making sure that it is kept in tip-top condition. We know that wine is sensitive to oxygen. It's also sensitive to UV light, both of which will impact its drinking quality. Wine itself is high in acid, so it's got a pretty low pH. It contains 8 to 15% alcohol. It contains sulfur dioxide as a preservative, both of which are sort of solvents. And certain packaging will have to withstand pressure. So some wines will have fairly low levels of carbon dioxide or CO2, but other sparkling wines will be, fully sort of 5 or 6 bars pressure within the container. So it's got to be able to withstand all of that, not chemically react with the wine in any way, and to allow the transport from A to B for it to arrive in consumers' hands, as I say, without picking up any sort of taint from the external environment, from the packaging itself. And so it's a really important part, really, of wine quality. I would also say that wine packaging breaks down into 3 parts. We're going to primarily talk today about primary packaging. So we're talking about the packaging that's actually in contact with the wine itself. And this has traditionally been, well, certainly for the last couple of 100 years, traditionally been glass bottle with a cork stopper, capsule and label. We're going to talk about other formats of that, but all of them will then come in secondary packaging, which is generally some sort of carton or wooden case in cases of 6 or 12. But again, secondary packaging includes the adhesive, it includes any labels on the outside of those boxes, any packing materials inside. And then finally, tertiary packaging, which is where you consolidate the boxes together, put them onto either a wooden pallet or slip sheets, and use some form of straps and plastic wrap to actually make sure that they don't move during transport and they're not damaged in any way. So all of these elements of packaging relate to one another. So what you determine as your primary packaging will actually have a bearing on the specification that you need for your secondary packaging, how it's protected, etc., etc. But we're not going to talk too much about that. But I think what we are going to talk about is a lot of principles, and the principles can apply to and should apply at every level. So I think we should be thinking about, if you're looking at particular wine, what should it be packaged in? How should it then go into, to be consolidated onto pallets and things. So if we're talking about wanting to be more sustainable, the two key areas I think in my mind are, how do we get greenhouse gas emissions down, reduce our carbon footprint? So we know that most wine at the moment is sold in glass, and we know that some of the issues with glass are it's very energy intensive to produce, and it's quite heavy to transport. So it has, like all packaging, it creates greenhouse gas emissions. But the other aspect of packaging is that a lot of it goes to waste. Even those packages that we think are recyclable are not necessarily recycled. Even things that you put into a recycle bin may not actually end up going into being processed and made into another container. So we're going to talk a bit about that, what some of the barriers are to that. And the question really, I guess, is, can we do both? Can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and become circular? And on that note, I'm going to ask Richard to kick us off, perhaps with an overview, an understanding of how you define circularity and what we mean by a circular economy.
Thank you, Jane. It's a bit of a bold start, I suppose. I want to be a bit careful putting my own personal definition on a circular economy, but I'll give it a go. And then I'm going to take you through two live examples of where at the park, which is the packaging facility that we run for Accolade, where we've done some circular economy. We talk about two things within our business. We'll talk about the waste hierarchy. So we will look, I suppose, at the very top, you want to prevent what you're doing using that. And if you can't, you then want to minimize. And then you get into your reuse and then recycle. And for me, that's where the circular economy really comes in, is that it's ultimately aimed at, can we design our products to minimize their usage? Can we then ultimately find a way that the waste from that usage becomes the resource to make another product or the same product again? So I suppose you're very much on the recycle there, maybe tipping into the reuse. So the examples that I suppose I'll throw out there that might then get explored when we get into questions is, we did do reuse with Loop. So some people might have seen in the press that Tesco's had a year trial with Loop, which really interestingly, they've just stopped. And we were the only wine partner that went in with Loop, and we were the only wines that were in there. The interesting issue with, I think, wine in that reuse place is we had to use a heavier bottle. So for you to achieve what Loop were ultimately trying, which was 10 cycles of that bottle, so i.e. the bottle would go on the shelf, would be used, would come back through a cleaning process and back, we had to use a heavier bottle. The economics.
Richard, could you give us an idea of sort of how much heavier it has to be, and then perhaps we'll get an idea of what that really, so what does that, what makes a reuse work and where doesn't it work? Because I guess when you're transporting them around and they're a bit heavier, and you got two different things happening here?
So I suppose I'll answer that, Jane. We're a commercial wine business. So the wines that we sell are typically retailing around your sort of £6 point, with some of them going up to £8-9. Typically, we are either a 330 gram bottle or a 390. What we used for Luke was 530. So 530 gram was used and had to go through a testing system. So we went up with that weight. The economics then at the moment of, if you like, the cleaning cells and bringing that back around, the economics were not strong at all. And it was something that we very much ventured into because we see it as a route that needs to be understood more and to see where it could move to. So that's been our experience of reuse. The other example I was going to bring to life that I think is circular and is slightly different to packaging, and I brought a couple of props. These days we don't like PowerPoint, do we? So my prop is good old wine labels. So at the site, the wine label comes in, and ultimately we use it's on a backing material that is PET. So we end up, label goes on, and we end up with what we call a cheese, big reel of PET. Now, what we've done was we've been zero waste to landfill for a number of years. That goes off. We work with a company and it gets recycled into actually garden furniture and carpet fibers. So for us, a really big tick, something we were really proud of, that we were recycling our product and things weren't going to landfill. What I love about the team at the park is simultaneously, we've started 3D printing some of our parts. So we ventured into 3D printing because ultimately we were buying our machinery. We use Krohn's machinery for our bottling lines coming in from Germany, machine parts, expensive, and you have all the issues of transport and moving around. So this is a cog. We were paying £80 shipping it in from Germany. This is the same cog, 3D printed on our site for a cost of £2. Now, the circular bit that sort of blows my brain a bit, that the team that we've literally realized in the last month or so, is we now shred this PET backing on site and convert it into filament and then print it into this.
Wow.
So ultimately now, packaging that comes in as a waste stream in our site ends up actually within our machines as a machine part. And for me, it's one of the best circular economy bits that I've seen. So it's great. I think that we found a way within the wine industry to create a circular economy, not in the packaging, but that is something that for us, from a financial, from a footprint, from our ability to actually uptime, reduce your cash tied up in spare parts, it ticks a multitude of boxes, and I'll probably wrap up there because I've.
I was just going to ask you one last question then about this zero waste to landfill.
Yeah.
What was the biggest challenge for you? What was your biggest generator of waste, first of all, and what did you do?
I think I'll go back to, we've managed to get huge engagement. It's about understanding the waste streams and actually then having a behavioural buy-in from everyone on site to make sure we get that segregation, because there is always a couple of big items. You've got to go out and find partners. So we're very, doing sessions like this is great because people end up coming and wanting to work with you and engaging. So the guys who ultimately took our PET back in UPM, Raffatech, they approached us and we sort of work in partnership. So it's about identifying the streams and then finding solutions for them. And it wasn't a huge challenge. We've been there for about 5 years. But then for me on that engagement, it's about people then understanding that waste hierarchy. So we spend a lot of time, and therefore one department of engineers hooked up with the guys on the line and go, actually, we've got 2 projects running in parallel here. We should bring these together.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating actually, because you hear it time and time again. Any company that wants to do sustainability seriously, it can't just be down to an individual or a team. Actually, to make it really, really work, it's got to be, as you say, the engagement of everybody and the ideas and the training and the understanding of what it is you're trying to achieve. So I'm perhaps going to move us on then to talk a little bit about glass. And as I think I said in my intro, you know, glass represents something like 85% of wines that are sold to consumers are in glass still these days. So that's about, if you take the global production or consumption of wine every year, we're talking about in the region of 27 billion glass bottles in the global wine trade. So I guess my question then is, how much of that is being, we talk about glass, okay, we know the downsides, and we've covered that in previous sessions before. But what are, you know, how much is really recycled? Because we say it's closed loop and it's recyclable infinitely. Is it actually happening like that? And if not, why not? What can we do about it? Shikra, can you?
Jane, keep me right here, will you? Because if my signal breaks up, I just turn off the camera here just so that I can answer it. All right. Can you still hear me now? Yeah.
Yes, we can. Okay,
so yeah, it's an interesting piece when we come to talk about recycled and materials collected for recycling, and there's a vast difference between both of those. We employ systems that are set up to collect as much recyclable materials as we can, but whether those materials get through and are actually recycled is another question. When it comes to glass bottles themselves, recycled glass content is a real fundamental in our sustainability journey. There's a well-known figure that for every 10% recycled glass that we use, we reduce carbon by 5%. And so obviously within the glass industry, then we're really keen to get as much glass back as we can. When we look at the bottles, then if we look at different colors, specifically green and flint, which is the clear bottles, green, we would be targeting 80% recycled content. We did do a trial in February 21, where we actually got up to 100% recycled content. And for clear bottles, it's normally around about the 40% mark. And part of the reason for that is recycled content, when you start using it, you do get a level of contamination. So you get a level of discoloration if you go much higher than 40% with clear bottles. But I think the key aspect of this is, I think you mentioned there about recycling quantities and so on, and they vary quite massively throughout the world. European perspective, we have an average of about 76%, and there's some lovely peaks within that. For example, if we look at the UK and Ireland, the south of Ireland and Wales are the two leading lights, with almost 90% of glass collected for recycling. The opposite of that is when you start getting into the likes of the States or China, you're down below 35% on most occasions. And that makes it really difficult. But what's really important there is glass is an infinite material, can be infinitely recyclable. It doesn't degrade in terms of quality. So once we have made it, then the challenge is to try and keep getting that glass back, remelting it and reusing it again and again and again.
Mm. So just going back to Richard's example of the reusable bottle, which was, you know, having to be 530 grams instead of his sort of 390, and you know, how much difference does that make in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and how much difference then does, if it was all 100% recycled cullet produced from recycled? Could you give us a sort of feel for, because you've got these two levers, haven't we, to play with, and so what are they equal in terms of their potential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or is one more important than the other?
Yeah. Well, I think they both play an overall role in what we do. So leaving aside switching to alternative fuels, which we can talk about, but the lighter weights that we make the bottles, the more bottles we make on that same period of time, or more for the tonnages that we make, and that's normally how we measure it. it's energy consumed per ton of glass.
Yeah.
So if that's an average of 1,500 kilowatts per ton, so if you can make, you know, another several X amount of bottles out of that, then the impact per bottle is going to be significantly different. But that is then massively contributed to by the amount of recycled content you can make, or you can use, sorry.
Okay, and then when you talked about recycled content and the disparity between different regions and things, what is behind that? Is that because there just aren't collection schemes, or there is no demand for glass to be recycled in certain areas, or what makes the difference?
I think the demand for glass is there. You know, from a glass industry perspective, we recognize that, and I suppose it's probably worth stating that if you look at the four the biggest glass companies in Europe, ourselves and Veraya, OI and Arda, all of us have committed to science-based targets. So we've made a public commitment from an industry perspective that we're going to address our carbon impact. And one of the ways that we have to do that is through recycled content. It's a particular frustration, I think, for us, where we don't recognize the potential of recycled materials. They're seen by many as just a waste and an inconvenience, but not only from a glass perspective, a paper perspective, a plastics perspective, as Richard rightly pointed out there is a capability for us to keep reusing materials. If we look at the UK, for example, actually, if we look at even lesser extent, if we look at Northern Ireland, small region, you know, 1.9 million people, but we have two separate systems for collecting glass. One is a mixed bin system where we put paper, plastic, metals, glass, all in the one bin. And the other system is where we have separated boxes where glass goes in one, plastics and metals in another, and paper, cardboard, and so on in a third. When we look at what we get out of those, from the figures that we've been working on, we recover about 85 to 90% of the glass that goes into the separate box. The glass that goes into the mixed box, we're getting less than 40%. Now that's because of the levels of contamination that you get in there. And ultimately, does that glass end up? Probably in incineration with the bits of plastic and paper and so on that you can't separate out. So not only does it adversely affect the glass available, but it also affects other packaging materials as well, like paper, for example.
Interesting.
And so I think the government taking an initiative in this and really looking at unified systems in some way, but really not taking this stance that they have, which says collect materials for recycling, but more collect materials that can be recycled afterwards. I think that's a distinct difference, which would change the systems. Right.
And can you just perhaps just briefly then tell us about some of the work that NSERC are doing or planning to do, looking at alternative fuels?
Yeah. So there's probably, when we talk about glass, there's three key areas, I guess, that really contribute to the carbon footprint. Transportation is the first one. We are looking at, we've done trials quite recently there on using rail. We've a rail siding on our site in Cheshire. And we believe that we can move maybe up to about 70% of our product by rail for our customers. So that has a good effect on it. We also did trials using HVO, hydro-treated vegetable oil, in our trucks. Again, worked particularly well. Didn't seem to be detrimental in any way to the trucks. So there's alternatives there from things that we theoretically move. But our 360 system that we have in Elton, a bit like what Richard and the guys do in the park, where we bring in wines from all various places throughout the world, and we fill them in the UK for the UK market. And that allows us to do a number of things. Obviously, we're transporting 23,000 litres or whatever that might be, which is 30-odd thousand bottles as opposed to 13,000 bottles on a container. So we know from a study that RAP did, we know from a study that we did ourselves, that has a massive impact in terms of the carbon footprint of those bottles. I mean, if we take Australia, for example, the transportation impact is reduced by 40% for the individual bottles that they end up. So it's significant. The second one then is that whole piece on resource efficiency and using more recycled content and developing and defining systems that allow us to do that. And then the third one is looking at fuels. Now, our site in Cheshire is less than 2 kilometres away from the HyNet project. So HyNet project is one of the 2 government-sponsored projects that are looking at the use of hydrogen. And we're working along with the HyNet project, and we're working along with Glass Futures, and we're working along with British Glass, and we're working along with anybody who will help look at how we could use hydrogen as a fuel in our furnaces. Now, that furnace of the future, this was a project that was we discussed previously, Jane, this furnace of the future project that was in Europe at one stage.
Yeah.
That was shelved, but I think there's a number of companies within the industry looking at that, and that we're the same. You know, is that furnace of the future a combination of electricity and hydrogen, or electricity and hydrogen and biofuels, or electricity, hydrogen, biofuels, biomethane, and what combination of those things that we're working at? We're very happy with the progress that we're making with hydrogen at this point. So we think that will be a significant impact. And ultimately, what does that mean? Well, our belief is that we will be removing about 90% of carbon emissions from glass manufacturing as a result of using.
And just realistically, can you give us a sort of timeline on that? When is that sort of likely to be available, sort of generally widespread from, you know,
yes,
when we...
The key thing is to get that supply of hydrogen coming through.
Yeah.
Information we have is probably somewhere around 2026.
Right.
So,
okay. So it's not right away, but it's not too far in the distant future either. It's not
right away, because we have to understand how we will use hydrogen in our furnace. So we have to go through that learning, and that's the work that we're trying to do now.
Yeah. Great. I'm going to move us on, because I'm conscious that we could talk for hours and hours just about glass, but we want to cover lots of other things, and we want to come back at the end for some questions. So I'm going to move on to Carlos, who, you know, Carlos is our expert extraordinaire on plastic. And, you know, I think one of the confusing things for all of us, as certainly for me as a consumer, is you know, we talk about plastic, but there are so many different types of plastic, and so many, you know, you talk about recycling glass being tricky. Well, some councils will recycle some plastics and not others, and all, you know, it's very, very complicated. So Carlos, could you explain to us a little bit more about composite and flexible plastic packaging, what it is, what some of the challenges are, and, you know, after everything you've heard about glass, you know, let's hear a bit more about plastic.
Yeah, exactly. What I used to say is, I see your problem's glass, and I raise it by an order of magnitude or more. The issue starts by even semantics. Plastic means absolutely nothing for someone like me, if you know what I mean. Plastic is a characteristic of a material rather than a material per se. So something is plastic when you can add heat and it melts, and then you can extrude it, or you can do something with it. As a consequence, plastic means nothing, and we need to go to what kind of material we're talking about.
Yeah.
When it comes to packaging, we're talking about polyethylene, polypropylene, PET, polystyrene, which are and PVC used to be, not anymore in most cases, but still we can count PVC as one of those. And then a lot of other things, nylon, PDVC, EVOH, a bunch of other things that are quite often added to those main 4 plastics, PE, PP, PET, and PS, to change their characteristics. And why do we want to change the characteristics? Because when we're talking about packaging, we're talking about functionality. Yes, Jane, you said it in the beginning. Of course, aesthetics is very important. And for the marketing people, aesthetics are the most important thing. And then they start worried about other things that are also quite important. But the point is that from a containment point of view, the most important thing of packaging is that it contains what is inside, and it protects what is inside. We need to remember that a vast majority of the, and yeah, I know in one slightly different, but a huge majority of the resources embedded in a product are in the product per se, not in the packaging. So the amount of energy that we spend growing food and transporting food, etc., dwarfs the effect that packaging can have. So we need to protect what is inside for sure, because that's what has more resources, and that's what has taken more energy to grow and produce. As a consequence, we need to see, in my opinion, we need to see packaging as that function rather than the aesthetics. And again, I'm leaving aesthetics aside for a second, but the most important thing is the function. And when it comes to function, plastics have very, very different properties. Yeah. So, for example, a very easy example: if you could have forget about the shape, but if you could have a bottle of milk, which is HDPE, pure HDPE or primarily pure HDPE, and you fill that with toothpaste, for argument's sake, and you left it on a shelf, in 3 weeks, a month, you would notice that it has lost a lot of its smell. It doesn't smell anymore. And we know that toothpaste smells a lot. Well, it just happens to be that HDPE is a terrible barrier against aromas. And anything that is inside HDPE, if it doesn't have a barrier, will just permeate through the plastic and escape.
Yeah.
And in the same way that aroma escapes.
Yeah, and I mean, I just throw this in because I know that you're going to talk more about flexible packaging, but PET bottles for wine are not the same as the PET bottles that we use for water. They have to have some sort of oxygen barrier in there, either a nylon film or some sort of oxygen scavenger within the plastic itself, don't they? So
correct. Otherwise, you know, a plastic, especially polyethylene, is primarily bad in that sense as barrier. It's very good in many other ways, but it's very bad as barrier. Lets a lot of things through. Yeah. So you need to add other things, otherwise the function, which is what we're talking about, just goes down the drain. As a consequence, you start making things more complex. Now, a few years ago, around 20 years ago, something in the packaging sector, something started happening, which was, we know it in the sector as the light weighing of material. And it happened with glass. You know, the glass sector has tried to make glass lighter, and it has happened with every single material. And in the plastic sector, primarily, well, actually in the plastics and metal sector, a lot of this light weighing came from the fact that from a waste point of view, from a disposal of the packaging point of view, when extended producer responsibility schemes, and parentheses, I need to explain what probably I need to explain what extended producer responsibility is. EPR schemes are the schemes that governments put in different countries. In Western Europe, pretty much every single country has an EPR scheme, in which the government takes money from the brands, from the producers, because those producers are putting packaging in the market. Okay, so depending on what kind of packaging you put in the market, as a producer, you need to pay certain fees. Some people see it as taxes. Some people see it as a contribution to the recycling scheme of a given country. You can take different views on that. But the point is that brands, producers need to pay a fee, an EPR, extended producer responsibility. And in theory, that money is allocated for the recycling of those materials. That in reality hasn't happened in most cases, but I'm not going to start talking politics about it. The point is that it happens. And EPR schemes invariably got fixed on weight. As a consequence, the less packaging you put in the market, the less you pay. And what's the best way of putting less packaging in the market? Making it lighter. And what's the easiest way of making packaging lighter? By combining different things that are flexible, that are very light by nature, and combine different characteristics so that you end up with the same functionality. Mm-hmm. And that's how we ended up with complex packaging, with complex, especially complex flexibles. And it just happens to be that they work, and they work very well from a sustainability point of view, because they actually save a lot of resources. They become more difficult to recycle, I agree, but sustainability is not recycling. And the problem I think that collectively as society have is that we invariably mixed sustainability with recycling. And yes, recycling is a very important part of the piece, but is by no means the only part of the piece. Okay,
Right.
so
But I think I'm just playing devil's advocate here, because I'm sure there are lots of people on the call, and I can see in the chat someone saying, I worry about plastics as we humans have so much in us. I mean, I think plastics are a bit scary for us because we hear about plastic pollution, we hear about plastic bottles in the oceans, we hear about microplastics getting into our bloodstreams. And so the question is, okay, I get the lightweight bit, but should we not be? And we know that there's that figure that's always mentioned about, out of all the plastic that's ever been produced since the 1950s, something like only 9% of it has ever been recycled, and probably only once, sort of thing. So there's a lot of, how can we just carry on making more and more and more plastic unless we start actually thinking about how we're going to recycle it?
Yeah, but you're talking about two different problems there, Jane. One is the plastic, the other one is the waste management. And the problem is that we confuse terms, we actually confuse problem. The plastics don't go to the ocean because they like to surf or they like a suntan. They like to go to the beach. I'm sorry, but that's not the case. The plastics go to the ocean because we as society are rubbish, pardon the pun, on taking care of our waste. Yeah, because
even if they don't end up in the ocean, though, and Richard very articulately talked about zero waste to landfill at the park. Even if they don't end up in the ocean, there is still an issue around waste. Are you saying that we should just accept that they're going to go to landfill, or tell us more about
no, not at all. If I accepted that plastics need to end up in landfill, I would not exist. we as a company, we absolutely deny the fact that plastics should end up in landfill because they are perfectly recyclable. The problem is that we have a legacy. We have a legacy of 70 years of having very cheap oil when we can produce very cheap plastic. But again, that's a completely different problem because of government subsidizing the gas and oil industry, which we are not going to get political either because it's very, very much on topic. But the point is that for 60 years, for 70 years, the world has been able to produce insanely cheap plastic to satisfy our demands. And that has
to be fair, I don't think that we realized during that time, it's relatively recently that everybody's focused on plastic and saying, we just
exactly.
growing.
But the problem is that we leave sustainability as just the recycling bit, okay? And that is if I have one message for you today, is that sustainability goes way beyond recycling, okay? And we need to take a full life cycle assessment point of view. How many resources you're actually saving in other parts of the supply chain that are not recyclable? I'm not saying that plastic should end up in landfill. They need to be recycled. But by the time they go to the landfill, they have saved enormous amount of resources already. Okay,
right.
So they have become already
into the debate about carbon footprint versus recyclability. And
precisely. And I'm sorry to say, but carbon footprint and life cycle assessment is way more important than recycle, because there's no point saving the plastics from going to the ocean if the oceans will be too warm because we contribute to climate change with other solutions, and therefore the fish will be dead anyway because we have raised the temperature of the oceans. Yeah, and the fact is that many plastics contribute to lower carbon footprint emissions in other parts of the supply chain. Unfortunately, as consumers, and actually as producers, the brands, as consumers, we don't understand that, and as brands, they have been terrible explaining why plastics are actually a more sustainable option than others. And because the plastic so far had been very cheap, the encouragement of recycling has not existed. And it just took David Attenborough, his turtle, and 25 seconds of footage to say, wow, all this needs to change. Yeah. And I think it's changing. I think it's changing very rapidly, but at the same time, there's a momentum of 70 years of production of plastic with huge assets. You have no idea the number of assets and the billions of dollars of infrastructure out there that produce plastic from oil. And that we cannot change overnight. It will happen, and the processes that some people like us are developing will contribute to that. So just very briefly, what is that process? What we do is just talk a little bit about what we do. We we do something called pyrolysis, which in the current lingo of the industry is chemical recycling. So essentially, instead of getting plastic and melting it, which is traditional mechanical recycling, what happens with PET bottles or with milk bottles is that someone comes with a bottle, they chop it up in little pieces, they melt it, and they make a new bottle, or they make a new bag, or whatever. That is called mechanical recycling. Chemical recycling is a process in which you break the polymer, break the plastic into its little molecular constituent, and then you can take those molecules to the process of making plastic or whatever else again. So in other words, you know that plastic comes from oil, and what we do is to turn that plastic back into oil that you can put again into the supply chain of the petrochemical sector, instead of using oil that you get from the ground. That's what we do, and especially that is done by many people, and we're developing, a lot of companies are developing chemical recycling process. Specifically, one thing that Enval managed to do is to create a pyrolytic process, a chemical recycling process for complex packaging, especially the ones that have aluminum. So aluminum is a very, very good barrier when it comes to packaging. Nothing goes through. So from a barrier point of view, is fantastic. And in the case of plastic aluminum laminate, so toothpaste tubes, some wine in bag, sorry, wine in box, the Capri food and juice pouches, baby food pouches, things like that. All these pouches have a layer of foil, of aluminum foil in between, and we managed to separate that. The plastic goes as oil, as I said, for the petrochemical sector, and the aluminum goes to recycling as aluminum. So that's one thing that we do. And we're developing other processes to do other kind of materials.
Fabulous, thank you. I'm going to move us on now, because I'm just looking at the clock and thinking we're going to run out of time. And Ollie, I want you to talk a little bit about the BiB Wine Company and what you do and how you link in with Carlos in terms of your proposition to your customers.
Sure, thanks, Jane. I think, if it's all right, I'll just sort of start with where we started, which was a fairly typical sort of startup story. It was over a dinner table. We'd been, as a family, so we're a family company. There's four siblings amongst the founders. And we had actually been discussing for years how annoying it was, how frustrating it was that there weren't good wines available by the box. And I think really during that sort of period, 10, 15 years, we had been attracted by the idea of having wines we wanted to drink on tap in our house, and how nice that would be. We knew that the wines would last for weeks once opened, and that was obviously an advantage. You can have a glass without worrying about finishing a bottle or whatever it might be. But it happened over a dinner, and it happened over a dinner in Paris, and it happened because I was serving a Northern Rhone Syrah with Christmas dinner that was absolutely delicious and just happened to come from a box. And it sparked a conversation about, surely this must be available in the UK now. There must be loads of other good boxes of wine around, and we found that there weren't either. So pretty much the next day we were coming up with business plans, and that was the start of it. But I think what made us turn it into a business was this environmental picture. And I think we looked into it and we were just absolutely stunned that it wasn't making more noise, that it wasn't a bigger deal. I think if you look at the fact that for every bottle you switch to a box, you save 0.453 kilos of carbon equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. That's a massive saving when you take it in the UK market as being part of 1.6 or over 1.6 billion bottles of wine drunk every year. That's the equivalent saving, if you were to switch everything from one to the other, of 750 million kilos. That's the equivalent of taking 350,000 cars off the road overnight. It's the equivalent of well over 1 million people flying to New York and back every year. And I think it's actually also that carbon saving is the equivalent carbon footprint of powering all of the residential homes in Manchester. So it's not a small thing we're looking at, and that's just the UK. So I think it was that pushed us over the line. We, as a company, we we sell quality wines, high quality wines. We focus on the premium sector. We're a direct to consumer business, and we're sort of e-commerce and subscription mainly. We also sell into the on-trade, into some bars and restaurants, and that works really well. And I think you said why, and of course I've touched on the why bag-in-box and what it was that made us attracted to that. But there's probably a question about why premium, and I think the starting point is personal reasons. We were frustrated because the wines we wanted to drink weren't available, so we thought that was probably let's do that for selfish reasons. We'll be more passionate about it. But I think it goes beyond that. We're creating a complete break with the previous iterations of box wines that hadn't worked so well in marketing terms in the UK and had created some perception issues. And I think we looked at the premium sector and sort of thought, well, actually look at what's happened with craft beer and the change of formats. And I think that's an interesting case study, because of course with wine, craft beer is such an unfair label, because craft wine has largely been craft since its inception, and it's really unfair. But wine and wine marketing has been sort of good and towards the craft end for a long time. But in terms of reinventing, if that's already taken, and we're already doing that, then what else can you do? So actually, I feel that in terms of a reinvention, coming to the market with a premium product that comes in a new packaging format, or a new iteration of a better iteration of a packaging format, brings huge advantages, and especially and mainly because of those sustainability reasons. So that's sort of in a nutshell what we do and why.
Great, thank you. Whilst you're there, I'm not sure whether you can answer this or Carlos. I think I can otherwise, but Max has asked, is there a fully biodegradable bag-in-box, brackets, no plastic included? I would say no.
No, and let me start with those definitions, which are important.
Yeah.
Biodegradable is still plastic if it's a plastic. There's biodegradable plastic, but it is still plastic, okay? As I said, plastic is a characteristic of the material, and the fact that it might be biodegradable is a different story. Now, from the point of view that it might be biodegradable plastics have terrible barrier properties, so you would have to have something else on that to form the barrier. And as far as I know, there's not such a combination.
Right. And Fiacre, we've got some glass bottle ones. People asking about recycling. So does recycling glass generate greenhouse gas emissions in the process? I would say yes, because it still has to be melted and go through the furnace. But there's another one. Can wine bottles with wax closures be recycled? I.e., is the wax able to be removed during the washing process at the recycling facilities? Also, are all labels able to be washed off, or do some of the adhesive used for the labels prevent them from being easily washed off and therefore recycled? Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, so what happens normally in recycling is that the bottles will get crushed and then they'll be washed. So the crushing process normally releases any of the materials that are attached. I think the difficult thing is if you put an aluminium or a metal shield or something like that on the glass, you'll normally lose that wee bit of glass, but most other things are fine for recycling.
Great, thank you. And perhaps there's a question here to everybody. Considering the environmental impact, brackets minimal, with market acceptance, brackets consumers open to embrace, which of the alternative packaging formats do you think has the greatest potential to take share of the glass bottle? Fiacre, you probably don't want to hear this one. And,
yeah,
and as an industry, should we accept that glass bottle accounts for 85% of the packaging, or fight against that? Does anyone want to perhaps speak to someone?
Yeah, I'll give that one a go. I think it's interesting. I get asked quite a bit this question. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think what's happened at the moment with the way the market is changing, COVID particularly accelerating how we're looking to socialize differently. I think it's about the right format for the right occasion. So if you are in a sporting stadium where someone doesn't want glass because of maybe the dangers of that, therefore cans and PET have their place. The same with if you're camping or if you're space constrained. So the flat PET bottle, great for an airline where space is constrained. So for me, I think it's about finding the format that's right for the right occasion. And I think it'll be a long while before any of them overtake glass. Glass at the moment is the best format for looking after the wine for a long duration. So I don't know. I see the industry trying to get into this sort of argument of one against the other. I think it's where they sit side by side. Is it?
So we had a few questions sent in earlier before the webinar started, actually, and a lot of them around a similar sort of question about glass and alternative formats, and particularly citing fine wines. And I think, you know, the where we want wines that are going to be kept 2, 3, 4, 10 years, then really glass is the only option right now that is suitable. But where you've got wines that will be drunk within 18 months, 24 months, and also you've got this, you know, we've probably got a more diverse consumer base for wine than we've ever had before. Lots of wines going to countries that don't make their own wine, or they've started making it, but they're still importing large amounts of wine. We've got lots of different drinking occasions, like you say, whether it's sporting events, in the garden, wanting wine on tap, as Ollie was saying, at home. There's so many different ways that you drink wine and use it, that's for me, I think it is about there's lots of different formats, and the format has got to be appropriate to the wine itself, the occasion, the consumer. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Ollie, did you have something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, the wider points of which format for which occasion. I think Richard and you both said it. You know, we need a range of solutions. If we get stuck trying to pick the perfect solution and then work out how the industry is going to implement that, we will be here forever, and we just won't be doing our bit as an industry. We have to embrace the fact that we have an issue and present a range of options that create a saving, and that will fast forward our success in terms of emissions cuts. And I think the other area Richard mentioned, you know, the glass isn't going to be overtaken any soon. I think if we look to Northern European countries, we can actually see examples of where that has happened, and that's happened through certain amount of state intervention with plastic, or rather with packaging tax done by weight, and also pricing structures that are implemented according to volume. And actually that's encouraged box wine in particular to become the majority of sales in many of those markets. But there's no reason why we couldn't do something similar here and have all alternative formats take a share in that. When it comes to fine wines, I think we have to look at the history here. And I think, you know, when before the bottle was invented, which is actually not that long ago, fine wine wasn't aged in bottles for many years. More recently, we've started to see a trend going away from better premiums towards fine wines that need age. I think if you look at Cahors and the change that they're making there in terms of the amount of age their wines need, you know, there's a modernization of wines. And I think actually, you know, there are far fewer large cellars out there where people are aging wines for a long, long time. And I think fine wine actually, in the end, may come towards a sort of a drink now process, sort of state. I don't think that'll be completely the case, not for some time, but actually, if you look at it in the whole, fine wine makes up a small proportion of all the wines that are sold, produced, and drunk. And actually, if you know, we don't have time to sort of look for a perfect solution or try and fix the problems within glass manufacturing now, we need to switch to alternatives for the majority of wines. But actually, fine wines, there's probably a case to be made for the fact that there is more time to test how they react under different solutions. I would say, you know, the glass bottle is currently the best, and that's partly because of lack of trials. The better the quality wine you put into an alternative format, the better it'll react to its time in that format. So, you know, I wouldn't rule it out, especially with technology improving in the materials used.
Richard, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, I'm just thinking about different, not just the materials, but how you actually pack things into different shaped containers and things, and the impact of that has.
So I think the last point that Oliver made is crucial. our ability to fill a wine bottle at the moment and introduce less oxygen and to put it in and have it is far superior than on a bag-in-box filling line. And I fill a lot of bag-in-box, and we do it with pride, but ultimately that oxygen control isn't the same as you can achieve on a glass bottle at the moment.
But why is that? Why is that? Why can't we just flush it or create a vacuum like we do in bottles?
And technology and the headspace that you get in a bag with a process with filling. But the other bit that I was going to add that's linked to that people, when people talk about the life cycle, we write off on our site more product that's in the alternative formats than we do in glass.
Right.
Because of the shelf life. Retailers at the moment will only take certain shelf life. There's a big volatility in the UK market at the moment where the ability to forecast what sales are on promotions are incredibly challenging. So therefore, there has to be a switch if you want to change with the retailer, because often there'll be a run and there's X amount left in the warehouse. So, you know, the other formats at the moment are making headway, but that shelf life at the moment for me is their sort of biggest barrier in terms of trying to break where the glass bottle is dominating at the moment.
Right, interesting.
Yeah,
Go on.
Sorry, Jane, I didn't want to interrupt, but I mean, I think that's right. I just wanted to mention partly that's to do with scale. I mean, I imagine some of those issues are bigger at scale, and at sort of lower volume, smaller scale, you know, techniques can be found, and I would hope therefore be replicated later on at a bigger scale. When it comes to shelf life and predicting demand, I mean, I think the biggest piece here is actually to try and educate consumers and arm them with the knowledge so that actually we increase consumer demand and incentivize them to switch to all alternative packaging, including, of course, box wine.
Pietro, would you like to comment on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, from a glass perspective, without getting into too much of the detail, we talk about health, taste, and environment. And I take Carlos's point earlier on, but there's more to the environment than a straightforward label analysis, for example, where we factor in all these requirements for cleaning up the oceans that we mentioned, or where do we factor in the requirements for the mining of new aluminium as that demand increases and so on. But from a health taste perspective, I think there's some very interesting reports that have come out quite recently in terms of plastics in general, toxin levels, BPA levels. We had a report issued there a couple of weeks ago from a US NGO talking about antimony and the effect that it could potentially have. So I think when we look at, and it's really important to do this, when we look at sustainability, and we've mentioned a couple of times that we look at sustainability holistically. We don't look at it from a straightforward carbon perspective. There was a lovely cartoon come out quite recently saying, you know, carbon tunnel, that's what we see. We have to look at it from all the other aspects that are involved in that. So we look at it from a carbon perspective, we look at it from a human perspective, and we look at it from a nature perspective. And I think considering all those three will then help us guide us into the right materials that we need to use.
Great, thank you. We have 1 minute left, so I'm just going to go round each of the panelists and just if you have any further comments, and then I guess my question still is, you know, we still have this conundrum, what you've just said, it's like carbon footprint, we've heard from Carlos, so important to bring greenhouse gas emissions down, because if we don't, then actually potentially we won't be around as a planet and able to do anything anyway. But glass, circular economies, there's a lot more systems already in place for collection, it's happening. You know, where's it all going to go in the future, I guess? Just very, very quickly, I'm going to go around the room. Perhaps, Carlos, you'd like to start.
Oh, you got me out of nothing. From my point of view, you know, I work on the waste sector side of things, and for me, life cycle assessments are the only scientific basis of actually knowing what to do in order to protect the planet. And if we don't do those properly, we will end up with solutions that might not be solutions.
Right.
Okay? And from a materials point of view, it needs to be taken into account the whole scenario, and taking understanding that recyclability is just one of those
Just
issues.
one criteria that we need to bear in mind. Great. Ollie, anything to add?
Yes, I mean, I think it's, we've been round in circles a little on these subjects, but we just simply don't have time to be searching for the very best solution, or rather actually a perfect solution. We don't need a few people doing things perfectly in 10 years' time. We need everyone, or the vast majority of people doing things much, much better right now. I think climate change is king here out of the dangers that we face. And if you've got solutions that actually are recyclable with amazing schemes like Carlos's available, then we really should be looking at those as one of a range of solutions. And I must say that we've got to separate different materials here. We're not talking about one single thing being plastic. There are different plastics, and we're not talking about synthetic textiles or tires or road markings that end up being sort of microplastics in the oceans, or personal care products, or whatever it might be. We're not actually talking about a material type that ends up in the oceans at all, really, coming from the UK perspective and Western Europe. So we mustn't mix up different issues here. I think we would end up with scaremongering.
I think that's fair, but I would say, and I'm going to move on because we're out of time, and I always stick to time. This is probably the first time I've gone 2 minutes over already, so I'm going to stop you there. But I would just like to add, though, but there is an issue about what happens to the packaging after the consumer has used it. Richard?
Yeah, I'm just going to go on glass weight being associated to price point. I think retailers have to look at that. I think we managed to move away from cork to screw cap. I think the wine industry, certainly in commercial wine, needs to get lightweighting and break this association of glass weight with price point.
Great. Fikra?
And I think from a glass perspective, we know the challenges that we have when we are tackling them. And then when we do, we have that huge bit that goes to a single material, not requiring anything else, totally inert and better for a health, taste and environment.
Great, thank you. So I think what I'm hearing from everybody is that there's lots of stuff we can do. There's more formats than there have ever been at all. Ever before. You can choose different formats for different occasions, for different wines, for different consumers. But even if you are sticking with glass, there's actually a lot you can already do as well on your bottle weights and on your recycle, cullet content, and all of that stuff. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you all to the panel. I know that the five of us could definitely carry on talking about this for many more hours, but I think probably we would have a bit of a circular debate because it's something that's in process. We're all learning. There's no one ideal solution at the moment, and I think we just have to keep the conversation going and keep the good work going. And thank you all so much for joining us, and to you, the participants. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.